So our last session for today is by Karen Walstra, who is an independent education consultant, and she'll be our last speaker for today, and she'll have about 15-20 minutes or so to present to us today, investing in ICT for education. Thank you.
So I was thinking that I'd be talking to myself. So hello everybody, I'm Karen. As I said earlier, I am a teacher and that's how I see myself. I've taught for nearly 30 years. I work with schools and universities and institutions now in terms of looking at how do we change education and looking at all the things that people have said today and how we work within that space. So the World Economic Forum tells us that education is our fundamental driver. And it's a driver from 3 different points of view. So personal, national, and global development. And just think about that in terms of all the stuff that you've heard today. And think about all the children that are being educated or are not being educated. So at the moment, there are about 120 million children who are out of school, who should be in school but are not. And it's estimated that 130 million children cannot read and write around the globe, even though they have a grade 4. Think about yourself and what you could do at grade 4. But then this is even more scary. They talk about that by 2030, there will be 600 million more children who would need to be enrolled or enabled. And so that's a really, really scary stat. We talk about the stats within our own country and how many children we lose a year. And so for me, why should we invest in ICTs or in technology transformation? It's because of the children. It's because of the future, and it's because of where we're going. So that the divide doesn't get bigger, but so that the divide gets smaller and that everybody can impact in the long run. So, for example, these are jobs that were available here in South Africa. So I pulled this off pay scale the other day. Now, right now, think about your own children at school. Could they apply for these jobs? How well skilled are they in terms of the jobs that are available? And then look at the difference in terms of how many women and how many men. Look at the percentage difference. So how are we actually addressing the gender difference within that space? Look at these types of jobs and studies and research that has happened in South Africa. Do you even know these words? Do your children play in this space? So we've spoken about a bit of augmented reality or computational geometry or computer music. Are they the kinds of spaces that we could be encouraging our children to go into that are interests, that are things that they want to do? If we think of the way our schools are structured, where it's so linear and so stifling in many instances, how are we encouraging the creativity? And that we taking our children, think about that little grade R. What is the world going to look like when they finish school? And how are schools preparing those children for that kind of space? It's really, really scary. And who are these children? So if we think of young people, the stats show us that they want to work flexible hours. They want to work, but they don't want to work necessarily from 9 to 5. They want to work when it suits them. On an average, they're on the internet for about 2 hours, the millennials, and they believe 61% of them in the study showed that they think they'll have to be retrained. But now, look at the little ones coming up. So your Generation Z, they talk about a concentration span of about 8 seconds. They talk about them being on a device or on the internet for about 10 hours a day as a norm. They talk about that they are digitally native. You hear it over and over again. People are saying, they'll pick up my device and they'll know what to do. There was some neuro research that I was reading the other week that are saying that the newer baby synopsis even seem different. That it's if the humans are getting ready for a big transformation. And I'm looking for more research around that at the moment. But imagine what it's going to be like and how our children are going to cope. But how are our schools adapting? because we shouldn't be teaching the same way. We shouldn't be encouraging schools to be like that. Think about these jobs 10 years ago. So the children in Generation Z are younger than Google. How are we accommodating them? Google did a research with The Economist, so that was already in 2015. And then the guys were saying, or the companies were saying, that problem solving is the most important skill that business needs. Think about the projects your children bring home from school. How much problem solving are they encouraged to do? The next skill is teamwork. Now, I remember when I was a teacher, I was a meanie because at least one project a year, I'd say to the children, we're putting all your names into a hat, and whoever you draw out, you've got to work with them. And then they'd say, no, but I don't like so-and-so. And I'd say to them, but one day when you work, you've got to work with people you don't necessarily like. So it's not, do I get on with the person? It's, how do we solve this problem? Because that's the focus, to get through the work. So how do we actually teach children to work in teams? How do we get them to understand that you don't always agree with people around you? And so how do we develop the relationships within the school space and use the technology just on the side? Or do we integrate it? Looking at communication, it's not just being able to talk, but it's being able to do written communication really effectively. So saying children can't spell is not good. If you type in an email address wrong, it's not going anywhere. So how do we actually teach children to communicate effectively? How do we teach them to think critically? And how do we encourage them to be creative? So for me, I think it begins when we're talking about the school space with the teacher. Because if you haven't informed the teacher, when that classroom door closes, nobody else knows what happens except the teacher and those children. So it could go back to chalk and talk. It could go back to whatever the teacher's default is. So how do we take away the teacher's fear? How do we show them how the technology could be integrated to their benefit? And for me, that's really, really important, that teachers need to be empowered. Teachers need to feel comfortable with the technology and should not be forced to use every tech, because some tech is better in some subjects than other tech. And so how do we choose the technology which is relevant for that teacher, for that grade, or that subject? So how does it suit that individual? For example, showing a benefit in terms of saving time. If you use a type of assessment where assessments are marked automatically, think about that in terms of saving time. But on the other hand, think about that in terms of knowing immediately whether I carry on teaching or I've got to reteach. So saying to teachers, use the data that you've got to tell the story to suit the learner. Take the information that you've got and use it to your benefit so that you will get to know your children better. But on the other side is, if it's instantly marked, the children also know. So they will know, oh dear, I made a mistake, I need to relearn. And the idea of a mistake not being bad, but it's a mistake in terms of now I'm learning more. So our whole notion of fail should be turned on its head. And it should be said, this is how we learn. We learn by making mistakes. We learn by working through processes. We don't, if we're just getting everything right all the time, what are we learning? How are we growing? And so taking away the fear of making a mistake. And growing within that space. educators, when they're using technology, find so many benefits. And so the reason for putting technology into a teaching space is to say, how is it of benefit? It's how do we change the learner? But then it's how do we empower the youth? How do we encourage the children within that space? So for me, a group of academics took Bloom's taxonomy. It was a group led by a lady by the name of Anderson. And she put creating at the top. And for me, that's really, really interesting. How many projects have you seen your children bring home where the children have had to create or think? So how are we encouraging the children to think critically and to create? For me, on the other side, on the left-hand side, that was a graphic or a drawing that was made using on a Google spreadsheet by a school in India, and every child had to make their own drawing using tables, using mathematical statements. For me, that was really exciting. It was Diwali when I was there last year, so that child had done one of those. But how are we taking the technology we take for granted and making the children stretch beyond that? That we can have technology that is actively collaborative in real time right now is a game changer. That you can be editing a document, not waiting for somebody to unlock it, but we can all be in the same document now. We can peer teach, we can peer work. And so we develop each other's skills within that space, from a teacher's point of view and a student's point of view. And so when we use technology within the space, the learner feels empowered. But how are we developing this creativity? How are we allowing children to grow within that space? How are we fostering that? So going back to what Alta was saying earlier with the comment about how do we use coding and robotics to build this, to solve problems, and to make children think? How do we use the technology to suit the need for that particular time? How do we create opportunities at home, at school, where children can learn these new skills in a fun way, where they're not threatened? How are we preparing our children for the future? How are we encouraging them to think? How are we building the community and drawing on all sorts of people and allowing children spaces where they can demonstrate what they are good at? That it's not just in my classroom, but it's beyond. But then it's beyond the classroom. How do we empower the youth? Mobile is huge. Looking at the different mobile platforms that people are using. How do we build that into the solution for what we want to do across the country? How do we teach young people to be adaptable, to know what's out there for them to learn from? How do we encourage them to self-study? All the children that have dropped out of the universities. How do we get them to realize that there are so many courses online that they could be doing? So yes, there are hotspots that are going up around the country, but are there billboards under the hotspots to say, hey, look at all this info that you could be learning from? Or do we just think that it will be absorbed somehow? How are we educating them? How are we growing the markets within that space? We can use it using growing the GDP. We can look at new services that are available within the space. We can look at workforce transformation, business innovation, creating an awareness. How are we inspiring our children to be the next inventors of things like Google's Loon or Google Car? Why shouldn't those people be coming out of our country, our schools, and our societies, like an Elon Musk? So we can do this. And what we need to do is we need to inform and we need to empower. And so the words are gone. It is possible. How do we do that? And I think it takes a community to do that, not just the product. And yes, the product's there, but how do we get people to know about the products? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Karen. We've just got time for one question. If anyone's got a question for Karen.
It's time to go.
Too late in the day. All right, guys. Thank you so much for being accommodating. I think we've come to the end of the conference, and I've been very humbled and pleased to be your moderator this today. And the two things that really came up out of the conference, listening to speakers, is there still has to be a very human element to what we're doing, which is quite important. And also, in terms of the technology that we use to disrupt in the education space, we actually need to make sure it's relevant. I think those two things for me came out in all the sessions we spoke about. And I think it's one of the things we need to carry on. An additional theme to that for me would be a Pan-African focus. So in speaking to lots of innovators across the continent, you see innovators who are solving for local problems. However, we need to start thinking Pan-African from day one. And with that, guys, I'd like to thank you so much for participating today and staying to the very end of the session. And with that, I'll give a hand over to Abe, the CEO, to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Namdi. I don't have much to say. I just want to thank every one of you for attending. Hope to see you here in 2018. And thank you to the sponsors and our partners. There's a raffle draw that's going to happen now for a gift from Networks Unlimited. Thank you and see you next year. I'm going to hand over to Vardis, our head of sales. Thank you.